"Dammy, why don't you join me in the bush tomorrow? I'll teach you how to find the best firewood," Baba Arlau said, his voice unusually gentle. His eyes lingered on her, a trace of something unnerving beneath his wrinkled smile. Dammy paused, her small hands clutching a clay bowl as she rinsed it under the open-air tap. The suggestion was strange. Baba Arlau had always gone alone. "But Baba, I have schoolwork," she replied innocently, her brows furrowed as she turned to face him. Her bright brown eyes sparkled under the fading sunlight, innocent and trusting. Baba Arlau's voice was soft yet insistent. "Ah, school can wait. You're always saying you're curious about the bush. Let tomorrow be the day, eh?" Dammy hesitated, the clay bowl slipping slightly from her fingers. Something about his tone made her uneasy, but she quickly brushed it aside. After all, this was her grandfather, the man who had raised her since she was an infant. She smiled and nodded hesitantly. Dammy's life had always been a mix of chaos and resilience. Born out of wedlock, her existence had been complicated from the very start. Her mother, Igbo, had been just a teenager when she gave birth to her. The shame was too much for Igbo to bear, and so she left Dammy in the care of Baba Arlau, her own father, shortly after Dammy's grandmother passed away. Igbo returned home only at night, exhausted from her job at the local market. The house was small but lively, often filled with the chatter of neighbors and children. Dammy was popular among the other kids, who flocked to her during the afternoons to play games. She was cheerful and curious, always asking questions and exploring her little world. These daytime distractions left Baba Arlau with no opportunity to act on the dark thoughts that clouded his mind. At night, the presence of Igbo was an unspoken barrier. Baba Arlau would sit on his wooden stool, staring into the flickering kerosene lamp, his mind restless. The shadows on the walls seemed to mock him, whispering his vile thoughts back to him. He'd sigh heavily, his plans foiled yet again. It began with a seemingly innocent gesture. One evening, as Dammy played with her doll in the corner of the room, Baba Arlau called her over. "Dammy, come and sit on my lap," he said, his voice calm but tinged with an unnatural sweetness. Dammy giggled and skipped over, climbing onto his lap without hesitation. She was a child, trusting and unaware of the storm brewing within him. "You're growing so fast, my little one. Soon, you'll be a big woman," he said, his hand resting on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her face lighting up. "Do you think I'll be tall like Mama?" she asked. His throat tightened, and he nodded absently, his thoughts far darker than her innocent question. Just then, a loud knock came at the door. It was Mama Funmi, their neighbor, asking to borrow salt. Baba Arlau's grip loosened, and Dammy slipped off his lap to fetch the salt. The moment was gone, and with it, his chance. A few days later, Baba Arlau tried a different approach. He noticed that Dammy loved stories, especially the ones he told her about his youth. One night, he called her into his room under the pretext of sharing a special story. "Dammy, come. I have a tale that only special people hear," he said, his tone coaxing. She entered eagerly, sitting cross-legged on the mat. "What story, Baba?" she asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. He began narrating, his voice rich and melodic. The story was about a young girl who ventured into the forest to find a magical treasure. As he spoke, he subtly leaned closer, his hand inching towards hers. But just as he was about to touch her, Igbo's voice rang out from the kitchen. "Dammy, come and wash the plates before you sleep." Dammy jumped up. "I'll hear the rest tomorrow, Baba," she said cheerfully, running out of the room. Baba Arlau sighed heavily. Another opportunity had slipped through his fingers. The third attempt was more deliberate. One evening, Baba Arlau feigned illness, lying on his mat and groaning softly. "Dammy," he called weakly, "please bring me some water." She hurried to his side, her face filled with concern. "Baba, are you okay?" she asked, placing a small hand on his forehead. I don't know, my child. Maybe I need you to stay close to me tonight, just in case," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dami nodded, sitting beside him with her legs tucked under her. She watched him intently, her innocent eyes full of worry. Baba Arlau shifted slightly, pretending to be in pain. He reached out and placed a hand on her arm, his grip firm but not alarming. But just as he began to speak, a loud crash came from the kitchen. Igbo had accidentally knocked over a pot, and the commotion brought Dami to her feet. "Let me help Mama," she said, running off. Baba Arlau clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. He realized he needed a foolproof plan, something away from interruptions. The fourth attempt was bolder and more premeditated. Baba Arlau decided to exploit Dami's love for sweets. One afternoon, while Igbo was still at the market, he returned home with a small packet of chin-chin, a rare treat for the young girl. "Dami, I bought this just for you," he said, holding out the packet with a wide smile. Her face lit up as she took it eagerly. "Thank you, Baba," she exclaimed, popping one into her mouth. But there's a game we must play before you can finish it," he said, his tone deceptively playful. "Come, sit here." Dami, her mouth full of the crunchy snack, sat down beside him on the mat. He began to explain the game, weaving it with innocent-sounding rules that required her to close her eyes and follow his instructions. As she shut her eyes, he reached out, his hand trembling as it moved closer. But just as he was about to touch her, the sound of children playing outside grew louder, followed by a loud knock on the door. "Baba Arlau, we're here to fetch Dami for the game," one of the neighborhood kids shouted. Dami's eyes flew open, and she jumped to her feet, the packet of chin-chin forgotten. "I'm coming," she called out, running towards the door. Baba Arlau sat frozen, his plan thwarted yet again by the lively presence of others. Baba Arlau decided to exploit Dami's fondness for bedtime stories again, but this time, he chose a different approach. One night, as the rain drummed softly on the tin roof, he beckoned her to his room. "Dami, the rain reminds me of a story my father used to tell me," he said, patting the space beside him on his mat. She hesitated. "Can't you tell it in the parlor, Baba?" No, my child. It must be told in here for it to feel real," he replied, his voice gentle but insistent. Curiosity got the better of her, and she sat beside him. He began weaving a tale about a brave girl who had to endure a storm to find a magical treasure. His voice was smooth, and his words were enchanting, drawing her into the story. But as he leaned closer, attempting to place an arm around her, the wind blew the door open with a loud bang. Igbo, who had just returned home early from the market, stood at the threshold, her face lined with fatigue but her eyes sharp. "Dami, what are you doing here?" "Go to your room," she said firmly. Dami jumped up and ran to her mother, leaving Baba Arlau muttering under his breath, the tension in the air thick. This time, Baba Arlau tried to use chores as an excuse. On a sunny afternoon, he called Dami into the storage room, a small, dimly lit space that smelled of dried herbs and old wood. "Dami, help me find my lost tobacco pouch," he said, pretending to search the shelves. She obediently stepped in, her small frame almost swallowed by the shadows. As she bent down to check under a stool, Baba Arlau moved closer, his heartbeat quickening. He reached out, his hand trembling. At that moment, the sharp voice of Mama Funmi calling from outside startled them both. "Dami, come out, let's play Io before the others arrive." Dami's face lit up, and she dashed out of the room, leaving Baba Arlau standing there, his hand still outstretched and his plan ruined. One market day, Baba Arlau noticed that Igbo would be gone longer than usual. He planned to seize the opportunity by asking Dami to help him fetch water from the nearby well. "Dami, the pots are almost empty. Let's fetch water together, he said, picking up 2 buckets. She nodded, eager to help. As they walked to the well, Baba Arlau's mind raced with thoughts of how he could isolate her further. When they reached the clearing, he suggested they rest under a large tree. Sit here, Dami. I'll tell you a story about this tree, he said, pointing to a spot on the grass. She sat down, her legs crossed, her eyes curious. He sat beside her, inching closer with every word of his fabricated tale. But as he was about to act, the loud chatter of 2 women returning from the stream broke the silence. Ah, Baba Arlau. Are you resting here too? One of them called out, laughing. Dami smiled and waved, oblivious to the tension in her grandfather's clenched jaw. The women's unexpected presence forced him to abandon his plan yet again. Desperation crept into Baba Arlau's actions. One evening, he decided to lure Dami into his room under the pretext of a ritual. Dami, there's an old prayer we must say together for good fortune, he said solemnly. She frowned, confused. But Baba, I've never heard of this prayer before. Ah, it's a secret prayer, only for family. Come, kneel here, he urged, pointing to the mat on the floor. Her unease grew, but she obeyed, clasping her hands together as he instructed. As he began muttering incoherent words, he reached out, his intentions masked by the guise of the ritual. Just then, the power came back on, flooding the room with light. Dami's face brightened. The light is back. I can read my book now, she exclaimed, jumping to her feet and rushing out. Baba Arlau slumped onto the mat, defeated once more by forces beyond his control. That night, as Baba Arlau lay on his mat, an idea struck him. The bush. It was the one place where they could be alone, away from the watchful eyes of neighbors and the constant presence of Iyabo. The thought festered in his mind, growing darker with each passing moment. The next morning, he made his move. Dami, come with me to the bush today, he said, his tone light but firm. She hesitated, but his insistence won her over. Okay, Baba, she replied reluctantly, her voice barely above a whisper. The path to the bush was narrow and winding, lined with towering trees that cast long shadows over the dry earth. Dami skipped ahead, her bare feet kicking up little clouds of dust. Baba Arlau walked behind her, his gaze fixed on her small frame. Stay close, he said, his voice carrying a strange edge. They reached a clearing where a pile of dry firewood lay scattered. Baba Arlau set down his machete and began gathering the sticks. Dami joined him, humming a tune she had learned at school. Suddenly, he stopped and turned to her. Dami, come here, he said, his voice low. She approached hesitantly, sensing something was off. Chapter 9, The Turning Point. Baba Arlau knelt to her level, his eyes locking onto hers. His weathered face, usually kind, seemed unfamiliar now. He reached out and placed his hands on her small shoulders. Dami, do you love me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She blinked, confused by the sudden question. Of course, Baba. You're my grandfather, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Good. Then you trust me, don't you? Yes, I do, Baba. Just then, Baba unzips his trouser and brought out his huge big manhood. Baba, do you want to pee? Dami shouted, trying to hold back at what she saw. No, Dami, this is our family medicine, Baba Arlau said, swingling his manhood. You can only grow tall like your mother when I input it into yours. You remember when you told me that you want to grow tall just like your mother? This is all it takes. Don't fear, Dami, I will be soft on you. He pulled Dami closer and made his way into her. Dami was scared and cried out, but Baba Arlau held her mouth. Dami was a virgin. Baba Aloha had deflowered her. Dami, you will grow taller now just like your mother. Don't ever mention what happened here to anyone. If you do, you won't grow anymore. Baba Arlau cunningly threatened her. "Are you okay now, Dami?" Baba Arlau asked. Before she could answer, the sound of rustling leaves interrupted them. Dami's head turned sharply towards the noise. Out of the underbrush emerged a familiar figure, Mama Funmi. Her eyes widened at the scene before her. "Ah, Baba Arlau, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice stern and suspicious. Baba Arlau quickly released Dami's shoulders, standing up and brushing off his trousers. "Nothing, Mama Funmi. Just teaching the girl how to gather firewood." But Mama Funmi's gaze lingered, her intuition sharp. "Dami, come with me," she said, extending her hand. Dami hesitated, looking back at her grandfather, who now wore a strained smile. "Go on," he said, his voice tight. Back at home, Mama Funmi wasted no time. She pulled Iyabo aside and recounted what she had seen, her voice low but urgent. "Iyabo, you need to protect that girl. Something isn't right with your father," she said. Iyabo's face paled, her hands trembling as she absorbed the words. Memories of her own childhood flashed before her, memories she had buried deep. That night, Iyabo confronted Baba Arlau. "Papa, I don't want you alone with Dami anymore," she said firmly. Baba Arlau's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Iyabo, Dami's mother, never allowed Baba Arlau to be alone with Dami anymore. She had put an end to the nighttime stories and many more. Though not quite convinced at what Mama Funmi had told her, but she said let her do her part and put things in order the way they should. In the weeks that followed, life in the family moved at its usual pace, filled with the hustle and bustle of daily chores. Iyabo ran her small provision shop while juggling her child's needs. Kunal, Iyabo's younger brother, had visited. He was preparing for his final exams and often locked himself in his room, leaving Dami to handle most of the errands around the house. Iyabo occasionally took time to relax with her close friend Auntie Folake, sharing stories and worries over bowls of steaming pepper soup. Dami, despite her youthful innocence, was growing into her responsibilities. She would wake up early to sweep the compound, fetch water from the communal tap, and sometimes help her mother in the shop. On some days, she would linger by the window, daydreaming about the stories her grandfather had told her about her future. "You'll grow tall and beautiful, like a princess," Baba Arlau had said with a sly smile. Dami believed him wholeheartedly. As promised, Dami started to grow taller. Her legs stretched, her arms lengthened, and she noticed her reflection in the mirror changing. She was thrilled. "It's working," she thought to herself, not realizing that these changes were the natural progression of puberty. Baba Arlau had succeeded in deceiving her. On 2 other occasions, he had taken advantage of moments when Iyabo was preoccupied and convinced Dami to allow him to perform his so-called ancestral blessings. Dami never obliged him out of fear or understanding. She simply believed it was all part of the promise to make her grow taller. Each time it happened, she would console herself with the thought that her grandfather was helping her. After all, hadn't she already started growing? Meanwhile, the family's activities revolved around preparations for Kunal's school graduation. Iyabo worked late into the night sewing his uniform and organizing a small celebration for the occasion. She didn't notice the subtle changes in Dami right away, the girl's increased appetite, her frequent tiredness, or how she would sometimes linger near the bathroom, clutching her stomach. During this period, Baba Arlau continued to do his grandfatherly duties, though Iyabo kept a close watch on him. He brought gifts for the neighborhood kids, bags of rice, and palm oil for Iyabo, ensuring his role as the benevolent grandfather. Yet, his presence always felt like a shadow in the home, one that Iyabo couldn't entirely trust. Months passed, and the changes in Dami became undeniable. She started waking up with nausea, her small, budding breasts grew fuller, and her once flat belly began to swell. Iyabo initially dismissed these as signs of puberty, but when Dami started complaining of dizziness and her appetite doubled, she grew concerned. Igbo began to notice other odd behaviors in Dami. She was quieter than usual, often avoiding eye contact and retreating to her room for long periods. When Igbo asked if anything was wrong, Dami would shake her head and force a smile. But Igbo's maternal instincts told her that something was amiss. One morning, as Dami struggled to button her school uniform over her swollen belly, Igbo's suspicions turned into fear. She called Dami into the living room and asked her directly, "Dami, what is happening to you? Why does your stomach look like this?" Dami hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't know how to explain it, didn't even fully understand what was happening to her own body. "I don't know, Mama," she whispered. Determined to get answers, Igbo took Dami to the local clinic. The nurse ran a few tests and then delivered the news that shattered Igbo's world. "Your daughter is pregnant," the nurse said softly, her tone filled with pity. Igbo's heart stopped. Pregnant? Her Dami? At just 12 years old? She couldn't believe it. Her mind raced with questions. How could this happen? Who is responsible? When did this happen? Dami, too, looked confused and frightened. She didn't understand how this could be. The only thing she could think of was her grandfather's rituals. It must be Baba, she thought, though she didn't understand the full weight of what had been done to her. When they returned home, Igbo was silent, her thoughts churning with anger, guilt, and pain. That evening, as Baba Arlau arrived home after a routine visit to their farm, Igbo didn't wait for him to settle down. She stormed into the room, her voice trembling with fury. "Baba Arlau," she began, her eyes blazing, "what have you done to my child?